Hi, I'm Yitzhak Berger. I teach Hebrew at Risha. Sefer Vayikra is typically divided into two halves, the first one of which addresses issues that relate to Kohanim in the Mikdash and speak to some extent about questions of Tum'ah versus Tahara, purity versus impurity. Whereas the second half addresses itself more to everyone and speaks about matters of Kedusha, of holiness. And roughly speaking, Kedusha is a matter of separating oneself and elevating oneself. It's a more positive kind of thing. Whereas Tum'ah versus Tahara is more a matter of removing oneself from something that takes you away, so that Tahara is really just the absence of Tum'ah. It's the absence of something that's removing you from being able to connect with the divine. In Parashat Tazria, we essentially have two topics. One of them takes up just a few verses, and that's the matter of the Tum'ah that attends a woman who gives birth and the process of her purification. The majority of Parashat Tazria speaks about a different kind of Tum'ah, and that is the Tum'ah that attends someone who has tzara'at, right? Someone who has this skin disease. And here too there's a process of purification. What's interesting about these two forms of Tum'ah is that they both in a way depart from the standard class of things that make you tameh. Most things that make you tameh are things that involve coming into contact or association with death or loss of life, coming in contact with a dead body, certain emissions from the body that you would associate with loss of potential life. In the case of childbirth, we would not normally associate this with a kind of loss of life. To the contrary, life has been generated and life has been given. And yet, the woman who gives birth has a certain tum'ah that's attached to her, apparently because even though a life has been generated, nevertheless, the woman who had been walking around with another life inside her now does not have that life inside her, and there is, or reports indicate, that there are feelings of loss that attend childbirth, where the child, a living being, is no longer inside the mother's body. And there's a process by which one has to overcome that. At the same time, tzara'at also does not instinctively suggest an association with death, except that in the famous instance in Sefer Bamidbar, where Miriam gets tzara'at for speaking Lashon Hara about her brother Moshe, the text does compare tzara'at to death. Moshe prays for Miriam and says, let her not be like a mate, comparing her tzara'at to death itself. So these two instances of Tum'ah represent what seem to be a kind of extremes, kind of polar opposites, cases where a person becomes tameh. What's interesting about them in particular is both of them involve processes, but if we look carefully, we'll see that those processes go in opposite directions. In the case of tzara'at, we're dealing with someone who, the way Chazal understood it, based on that story with Miriam, tzara'at afflicts the person because they did something wrong. And in turn, there's a process of removal from the camp, right? Removal from the holy area that the Israelites inhabited. And it's a three-step process. First, there's an inkling that maybe something's wrong. Then the person goes through another step until finally it's determined that that person has to be out for a period of time before a process of purification can even begin. In the case of childbirth, it just hits in one shot. The woman becomes tame'ah because of that loss of life. And again, there's a process beginning with that state of tum'ah, followed by a state where emissions from the body do not generate more tum'ah, and then finally the end of the process where the woman can restore her state of tahara. These two processes represent the opposites that they are. In the case of the Mitzorah, the person has really done something to make himself tamei, to remove himself from being able to connect with holy matters. And therefore he has to go through that process of removal followed by return. In the case of the woman who gave birth, nothing wrong was done, and it's merely a matter of an experience that, without her wanting to feel that sense of loss, nevertheless necessitates that she go through this kind of sequence before she returns to her state of tahara. The message of all this, arguably, is that there are different things in life that remove a person from a state of being able to connect with the divine. And some of those things reflect what the person, or result from what the person has done, like the Mitzorah who spoke Lashon Hara. And there is invariably a process, sometimes an elaborate and rocky process, before being able to get back the state of tahara, of purification. But then there are other things that, through no fault of a person, maybe even through a person doing an act that's fundamentally creative, in some fashion, generate an experience that makes a person feel removed. And sometimes a process needs to be gone through then as well, whereby the person, only after going through that sequence, can then achieve the state of tahara again. Both of these situations pose challenges. The Torah here provides appropriate solutions for both. Shabbat Shalom.